So we're picking up, continuing at the blood. We talked about plasma and the stuff dissolved in the water of the plasma. We also have things in your blood that are cellular. Remember, cells way, way, way bigger than molecules or other sorts of things dissolved in your blood. These, for the most part, are made in your bone marrow. And you actually have a population of cells that can become any one of the different types of blood cells. Your liver and your spleen have some ability to make blood cells, but that is not the main place that happens, and it's not their main functions. We'll start with the red blood cells, also known as RBCs, or erythrocytes, which really is Latin for red cells. Cytes, it means cells. Not a heck of a lot in a red blood cell. Doesn't even have a nucleus, as the nucleus pops out of the cells while they're in the process of being formed in your bone marrow. And so they're these kind of disc-shaped cells that are thinner in the middle than on the edges, because that's where the nucleus used to be, and now it's gone. And pretty much all that's in there is hemoglobin, a protein molecule with iron in it that is sticky for oxygen, but not super, super sticky for oxygen, because you want to be able to pick the oxygen up in one place and then have it come off to deliver to the cells someplace else. And the surroundings, the pH of the surroundings, a very small change in pH changes the stickiness of the hemoglobin, so that it's more sticky going through your lungs. It picks up oxygen going through your lungs. But when it gets out into your cells and the pH changes ever so slightly, it's much less sticky, and it can give the oxygen up pretty easily. Now, one thing, I've talked about this before, hemoglobin is much stickier for carbon monoxide than it is for oxygen. And if you are breathing carbon monoxide in, more and more of your hemoglobin will get carbon monoxide stuck on it where the oxygen is supposed to go, and it won't let go of it. So your blood is accumulating carbon monoxide, not dioxide, monoxide, as you're breathing. And you don't really have any way of detecting it, except as your cells don't get enough oxygen, then you'll get like headaches, and the cells will start to complain. Remember, your body can't track oxygen levels because the oxygen is locked in these cells. It tracks carbon dioxide levels, and if you're breathing carbon monoxide, it doesn't have an effect. You're still releasing carbon dioxide from your cells. You're still breathing it out when you breathe. So your carbon dioxide levels stay pretty normal. And so carbon monoxide poisoning doesn't make you breathe hard, or it doesn't do a lot of things you would think of if you're kind of losing your oxygen. Anemia is a shortage associated with your red blood cells. It could be a shortage of your red blood cells. It could be a shortage of the iron in your red blood cells. It could be a shortage of hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Anything that doesn't come up to the level you're supposed to have is an anemia, including sickle cell anemia, where you've got hemoglobin that isn't shaped properly with oxygen off of it. And so there's a lot of, just having an anemia doesn't really say anything. Is it, because different anemias they work differently, and they're caused by different things. Your body's really good at recycling iron. These cells do wear out after a while, and they're taken back in, they're broken down, the hemoglobin is broken down, and the bits and pieces of the hemoglobin, rather than go to the trouble of trying to recycle everything, that kind of gets released. Some of it goes, some of the parts go in and out your kidneys. That's what makes urine yellow. Some of it goes out of your liver down into your digestive system. That's what makes feces brown. And the iron is pretty effectively recycled. Unless you're losing blood, you probably don't need a lot of iron in your diet. So if you're male, if you're female, you're not losing that much blood in your cycle anyway, but you know, it can be more of an issue with females than with males. Males tend to recycle their iron well enough that they don't really need iron. And when I was younger, there used to be iron in everything because people figured it's iron, it's great, you know. And they found out that you can have too much iron in your system and it messes up some of your other chemistry. So you don't find a lot of iron boosted foods. Used to be the cereals all had it in, and people bought all sorts of stuff that, you know, that had additional iron in it. You don't find that really anymore. There is a test that they can run. Pretty quickly. They run a couple of tests when you go in to give blood. One of them, they take a drop of your blood and they stick it in this blue liquid. And the liquid is supposed to match the density of your blood with the proper amount of iron or hemoglobin or red blood cells in it. And as it moves or doesn't move in the fluid, it's an indication of some sort of anemia. They also may take and put a little of your blood up a tube, and then they put it into a centrifuge and spin the holy hell out of it. And the heavier red blood cells squish down to the bottom. And the white blood cells, which are a little bit lighter, wind a little bit layer above that, and then it squeezes all the plasma up above. And they can actually put that on a little scale and read where the top of your red blood cells are, and that's your hematocrit. And it's represented as a percentage of the column. Is that typically hematocrits are in the 30s, you know, 30s to 40s. It ranges, males and females are somewhat different. If you're losing blood somewhere, your hematocrit will drop. Or if you have other types of anemia problems, your hematocrit will drop. Platelets start out as fairly big cells, but before they're released into circulation, they're pulled apart into little bitty flakes, little flecks. And these at some point settle in your lungs, and the lungs, because when they leave your bone marrow, they're not ready to do what they need to do. They're not mature yet. They mature in the lungs, or at least they did the last I read about them. It was kind of an unusual process. And you know, things may have changed about that. You don't see stuff about, you have a handout about platelets. It's the only handout I've seen about platelets in all the time I've been collecting handouts. But these are pretty much involved in blood clotting. Also known as coagulation. So something injures you and it breaks blood vessels and the blood starts to leak out. And the blood clots. What is it about the blood leaking out that initiates the clotting? I always used to think, you know, it hits the air. Of course, the air makes it clot because it's like drying up. That isn't actually true. And if you think about it, things that lived in the water would be screwed because there's no air for the blood to hit and it wouldn't dry out. Is that what sets off the clotting is tumbling, turbulence. If your blood gets turbulent, it tends to set off a clotting response. And the clotting response makes patches, right? The fibrinogen is converted to fibrin. That forms almost like, on a molecular level, almost like what a gauze patch would look like if you looked at a gauze patch and seen all the crisscrossing little threads. And then the platelets fill in the gaps. They help to really make it a sealing patch. So it's pretty important. One thing we'll talk about later, this can be an issue when you get deposits inside your arteries. Things stick to the linings of your arteries, and as the blood goes over, it kind of goes over it, and it forms turbulence, and you will tend to form a clot and smooth that bump over, which is great, except now it makes your artery tighter. And then more stuff will stick to the top of that, and you'll smooth that over, and over years and years and years, you'll build a patch of bumps and clots that will eventually gets so there's very little blood going through the artery, going around corners especially. And we'll talk about that when we talk about arteries again. Now, some people have a genetic deficiency in one of the chemicals in the plasma that makes coagulation happen. Is if you've heard of hemophilia, that is not a problem with the platelets, it's a problem with one of the chemicals dissolved in the plasma. Then you got your white blood cells, your WBCs, also called leukocytes. Leuko is kind of an off-white, but that's kind of what your white blood cells look like anyway. You get a big pile of them, they don't look completely white, they look kind of sort of white. And this is your immune system's main fighters. I mean, you've got a bunch of molecules like antibodies that are involved, but this is the basis of your immune system. And your immune system is concerned very much with what belongs to you and what doesn't belong to you, what they call self and non-self. And being able to tell the difference is that something comes into your body that doesn't belong there, your immune cells kind of taste it to see what's there. If it's not on the list, they kind of rip it off and hand it to a molecule that will make antibodies to it. But also certain generic molecules that are typically on viruses or on cells that are infected with viruses or on bacteria, you'll throw a whole bunch of other chemicals at them. And then your white blood cells will respond by coming in and in some cases gobbling up the invaders, in some cases dumping a lot of oxygen radicals at them. Remember, we talked about oxygen radicals and how antioxidants are not necessarily a great thing, because some of your immune responses is using oxygen radicals to kill invaders. And there's a number of different responses that your white blood cells have in response to invaders. You have T cells that mature in here in your thymus gland, as though those are most of your fighters and your patrollers. And you have B cells, which are primarily in the job of making antibodies. The T cells, one type of T cells gives them the molecules, the antigens. We talked about this when we did proteins. The antigens, and the B cells generate the antibodies that it takes a while. Chances are, whatever the problem was, it's gone away by the time your antibodies are ready to fight it. But you're not going to get reinfected, because as soon as those antigens come back into your system from a new exposure, antibodies lock onto it. They basically say to your immune cells, come in and deal with this, and it never gets a chance to really take over, we hope. There's a few other things that your immune system can do. If you have an invader that is stationary, really too big for you to gobble up or really poison, but it's not moving, your white blood cells will actually perform chemistry that the cells in your bones would perform, and they will lock the invader inside what's called a calcium nodule. This is what happens with trichinella, the worms that curl up in your muscles. Once they're curled there, they don't move, and we seal them into a calcium nodule. Some things that leak out of implants that people get wind up being calcified because of that. And they're not turned into calcium, they're surrounded by calcium, and as a way of trying to isolate them from the system. A couple of things I want to mention here. People get what are called autoimmune diseases, being a Latin word for self, where for one reason or another, your system gets confused and it flags your own molecules as antigens. And of course, once that happens, you make antibodies to your own molecules. The system attaches to those molecules, and then your immune system comes in and kills those cells. There's a lot of autoimmune diseases. Probably the best known is type 1 diabetes. The cells in your pancreas that make insulin are flagged as invaders, and your immune system just kills them all. So you can't make insulin. And that's a difficult thing to fix, because if we somehow give you the cells to make insulin, most of the ways that somebody could do that, your immune system's going to react to those cells also. Is that they are trying to find ways to strip the antigens off of the cells and then implant them. But so last I knew, they hadn't really worked the bugs out of the system yet. But there's a lot of other autoimmune diseases. Rheumatoid arthritis, your immune system's going after the collagen in your joints. Is that there's a long, long list of autoimmune diseases that different people get at different points in their life. And it's kind of like allergies, where they can come out of nowhere and sometimes disappear. And while I'm on the subject, allergies, also your white blood cells reacting to things they're not supposed to be reacting to. We're exposed to a lot of things from the environment that are not dangerous. And during our early life, your system is supposed to kind of adapt to that, kind of get used to that. But there's some question as to whether, if our system isn't really exercised with real honest-to-goodness invaders, it starts to look for invaders where there are none. So it'll start to react to pollen or other sorts of environmental factors or molecules on food. And then your immune system reacts to them like they were invaders. And mostly on surfaces, you hope. If they get, deep into your system, then you get a major issue that has to do with this next thing I'm gonna put up. One of the ways your body reacts to possible invasions is inflammation. There are types of white blood cells embedded in your tissues all over the place, some of them in your circulation, and they release signaling molecules called histamines. You've probably heard of histamines. Histamines are a way of marshaling your immune forces. It calls in white blood cells. But in order to get white blood cells where they need to go, they're in the circulation. The local blood vessels, the capillaries, in response to histamines, they expand, which makes them leakier, makes it easier for more white blood cells to get into them and get out through the holes. But it also squeezes more red blood cells through the capillaries. They can't come out through the holes, they don't squeeze. But it does make the tissues redder and warmer because there's more blood flowing through it. And there's more liquid leaking out of your blood in those areas too, so it swells up. So a typical histamine reaction involves redness and warmth and swelling. All of that are just side effects to, let's get a whole bunch of white blood cells in here because something's going on. A lot of times that happens when cells get damaged, is that something comes in, damages your cells, molecules come out of your cells that are not supposed to be in your tissue fluid, and that can set off a local release of histamines. Allergies do that. Things on the surface, you've got these molecules in cells embedded in the surface, and we take antihistamines to try to block that inflammation. In your nose, all the liquid makes your nose run. It can cause inflammation in your breathing tubes. It can close the tubes. It can just fill them with phlegm, lots of stuff. And an allergen that gets too deep into your tissues so it can spread can set off an immune inflammation reaction that is much more widespread than it should be. And in some cases, it can go through the whole system. Now imagine all the little blood vessels in your whole system being expanded. All the liquid leaks out, you lose a lot of blood volume, your blood pressure plummets, your heart doesn't have enough blood, it's having trouble pumping because there's not enough blood coming into it. And this is what we call anaphylactic shock. It can fill your lungs with fluid. It can cause problems with the muscles in your throat closing off. You've got a handout that talks a little bit about this type of allergic reaction. But it tends to be things that get deep into your system. Injectables like spider bites and bee stings, food allergies. Those sorts of allergies are much more likely to set off a widespread anaphylactic inflammation than other ones. Okay, one thing to add in here before we go into circulation. I'll show you some pictures of this on the next video. Your lymph system. All this fluid leaks out of your little blood vessels. You don't want it to accumulate out there. You need to get it back and put it back into your blood. These white blood cells squeeze out the flow's coming out, they can't really get back into your blood through the holes they came out of, but they need to be in your circulation. So your lymph system is a drainage system. It pulls fluid out of your tissues. White blood cells migrate through your lymph system. It actually has little like barracks for white blood cells called lymph nodes on the drainage tubes. And it's a one-way from your peripheral system in back. Eventually it dumps everything back into your blood. So the tissue fluid and the white blood cells can get back into your blood. If you're having an infection or something and there's a lot of white blood cells and a lot of fluid accumulating, the lymph nodes will swell up. And like if you're having a problem up here, your doctor may poke it, you have lymph nodes embedded in your salivary glands. And so they'll swell up if there's a whole bunch of fluid and extra white blood cells going into them. And lymph nodes can swell up almost any place that there's an infection going on. And so it's a marker for infections in different areas of your body. Okay.